Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bible and Archaeology. We're so happy to have you here today, and we're very happy to have Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott with us today for a conversation about all kinds of things related to food and gender and ancient Israel and the Bible. This is a large topic, so by no means is this going to be the only conversation we have around these topics. Don't worry, but we want to talk about a couple stories relating to this with Cynthia today so that she can spread some of her insight with us about these topics. So Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Jordan, for having me here.
Now, you may have seen a previous interview with Cynthia here at Bible and Archaeology. If you haven't, I definitely recommend going back and watching that. We go through some things related to household archaeology, so we're not going to get into maybe all of those questions today. Today, we're going to be looking at two stories in particular: Jacob's stew and Tamar's cakes, and what this can tell us about food in the ancient world. But Cynthia, before we do that, where are some places that people can find you? I know you're a resident nerd with Bible for Normal People, so people should definitely go and check you out there. And you're always writing many things. So if we could give them, what are a couple books for people that might be interested in this topic, that are looking to learn more? What are some things from you that they can check out?
Well, good question. So some books, I guess the first one would be The Food in Ancient Judah. That was my dissertation. And so that's kind of what got me on this journey. There's that one. There's the edited volume, The Minute Archaeologist. So if you're interested in just beginning to learn about questions related to archaeology in the Southern Levant, they're really, bite-sized chapters. They're really small and easy to read because they were directed for a lay audience. Also, I've co-edited two volumes. One is the Handbook of Food in the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel. And that is really the only volume that is, about all things food. I'm sure we missed some topics, but so far the reviews have been great. And so if you're interested in anything related to food preparation, food utensils, food in specific books, or iconography or things like that, that will all be in there, and it will point you to other resources too. And then I co-edited a feshrift, so a book in honor of my doctoral advisor, Diana Edelman, and that is called The Hunt for Ancient Israel. And that has all sorts of interesting chapters on things such as historiography, archaeology, memory, the Persian period, King Saul, all the topics that Diana has covered throughout her career. So those are the books. The State of Old Testament Studies is coming out in the fall, and my colleague, Dr. Deirdre Fulton, and I have co-written the chapter on Iron Age II archaeology in that book. So I think that comes out this fall, and that's with Baker Academic. And I've got some other things coming up. So another project with Baker, another co-authored, but this time a book called Grounded Theology. And really that book is really trying to, bridge that gap between theologians and people such as myself who look at the historical and cultural context of ancient Israel. Because a lot of theologians say, hey, we need to pay attention to context, but then most of them don't.
They don't. They just skip right past it.
They skip right past it, or they try, but there hasn't been anything so far, at least to my knowledge, that's tried to bridge that divide. And so my co-author and friend and colleague, Dr. Libby Backfish, have just submitted the manuscript to our editor, where we've taken about 10 different themes. And there, of course, we had to really narrow down those themes, where I look at first the, cultural, social, historical context of that theme. And then she takes that information and tries to help us understand ancient Israel's theologies better. So that should really come out probably a year from this fall. And then I've just signed a contract with Erdman's.
You're so busy.
No, not really, but compared to others, I don't think so. But there's a contract with Erdman's to write a book on women in ancient Israel. So that's a few years down the road.
So we'll put the links to the available texts down in the description and some places where you can find Cynthia. But as you heard there, Cynthia can shed light on a wide variety of topics, which is why we've picked the passages that we had today. Because as you mentioned with the Handbook of Food, this is something that surprisingly isn't really talked about. And in some of these stories where it shows up, seems to just get skipped over. And so that's led us to pick the two passages that we have today, the story of Jacob and Esau with this stew scene, and then Tamar and Amnon. And these are two stories that a lot of the audience may be familiar with generally, but maybe not so specifically with the role that food plays here, and then some of the household dynamics that get played here. And so two of the guiding questions that come to this conversation are who prepared the food and why was the food prepared? And if you like what Cynthia has to say here, I would definitely recommend that you check out her Food in Ancient Judah book, because that helped shape some of what we're going to be talking about today. So there's more to be said about these things. Go ahead and look there. But Cynthia, let's start here first. What does the Bible say about food? Because as we said, that handbook has come in to kind of fill a hole. So there is something there, right? But what does it actually say about food?
I wish it said more than it did. That's the simple answer. I mean, there is some stuff. So of course, everybody automatically thinks about the law codes about food, Leviticus 11, or even the sacrificial system. So of course, you would think that, oh, there's a lot about food. Well, besides those two things, the amount of material we get about food is kind of hit and miss. And so, but that's to be expected, honestly, because the Hebrew Bible is not written to reflect the ins and outs of daily life. Right. It's not intended to be a documentary or a journal of somebody's daily life, just your average person's daily life. Rather, it's more about that monumental events and people and places that reflect what the editors and authors at the time would consider Israel's history and Israel's relationship with their deity in light of that history. So of course, they're not going to focus on things about, what did the cooking pots look like? Mm-hmm. What were the ingredients for a stew, since we're going to be talking about that? Yeah. Who prepared it and how? All those types of questions that I am fascinated by. We don't get very much of that unless it pertains to, and like as in our case, the narratives that we're going to be looking at, unless it has something to do with the story at hand, or unless if it's used in poetry, if it's being used as some sort of metaphor. So unfortunately, we don't get a whole lot, but we do take what we have from the Hebrew Bible, and then we use other sources at our disposal, especially archaeology. That's been very helpful to kind of put those puzzle pieces together.
So in these contexts then, and I guess especially with the text we're going to talk about today, since it doesn't usually talk about food, when it does in stories like this, can we take these descriptions of food or household meals at face value as real descriptions, or should we be asking questions about what it presents and why it presents it if it's normally focused on these other monumental concerns?
I think it could be both. I know I'm kind of skirting around your question by doing that. But
it feels like it's the natural answer, though.
I do too. I mean, of course, these are educated guesses, but I think they reflect reality. But at the same time, they can be so much more than that. There can be different meanings behind it. And that's when you get into the issue of the word food ways. Yeah. So food ways isn't just about the food. It's all about the meaning and the context and the history and the identity and the culture and the norms and all those things that are wrapped up with food, because food really is much more than just, the nourishment that we're taking in. It embodies so many things. And so as kind of a part of a narrative, it's interesting to see what kind of role the food plays.
Mm-hmm. And that's where we're going to jump on food today, is some of this narrative role the food plays in these scenes. Because as we said, in these stories, I think typically we're familiar with the grand narrative arc of the Jacob and Esau scene. But exactly what food is doing or why in this, or in Amnon and Tamar, what food is doing and why, usually, unfortunately, gets skipped over when it's such a fascinating, and I think one of the most relatable parts about these stories, that we're not, hopefully not living in the same situations as them, but the way that the food can bring us back into these things. I think it is unfortunate that it hasn't been touched on more, and I'm very glad that people like you are. And I think the audience will be very interested to hear some of the insight that this can shed on these scenes in particular. But before we do that, I guess one last introductory question. When we're talking about food here, and you're talking about food ways, we're also naturally talking about households. And so for the audience who, when we hear household, we may be thinking of the place where I live or the place where they live. Is that a fair understanding for household when we're talking about household in ancient Israel? Or is there a broader picture we need to be keeping in mind when we are thinking about food and food ways in households in these texts?
Yeah, I think most people would today use the term family and think that family and household are interchangeable. They're related, of course, and a family can and often does make up a household, but the term household is so much broader. And I think it can be used both in ancient Israel and even today, depending on your circumstances. So sociologists make a distinction between the terms household and family. So family is defined by people who are related to each other through kinship, through marriage, through blood, descent, people that you're related to. A household doesn't necessarily have to be just your family. It can include people that live with you who aren't related to you. And it can include people who maybe come to work with you, but aren't related to you. Maybe they live there temporarily. Maybe they don't live there at all. So as far as ancient Israel is concerned, what we think a household, or what the Hebrew term that we typically translate as house of the father, or Beit Av. Most of us who study this think that this is really reflecting the ancient Israelite household, which would include a multi-generational family. You have your patriarch, your matriarch, you have their unmarried sons and daughters, you have their married sons and their children, because Israel and Judah, like most of that region, were patrilocal, where when you get married, if you're a woman, you leave your own Beit Av and you go live with your husband's Beit Av. So you become part of that household. And so, it's a multi-generational family. That could also include, as for looking at terms of household, it could also include people who aren't related, who live there. So that could include slaves, that could include guests. It could also include people who are maybe just working there. So if you've hired some workers to help you with the harvest, or if you've got shepherds, maybe you have a large herd and you have hired professional shepherds. So those would all be considered part of your household. So it's more than just family.
It's a much bigger category, which I think leads to some confusion sometimes when we're reading some of these stories and who gets brought in and why. And it'll come back up, let's say, in some of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump into our first dining experience for the day, the story of Jacob and Esau. So just to kind of set the stage for everybody and where we're picking up, this is within some of those ancestor narratives in the Hebrew Bible, right? Jacob and Esau are the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. And we have this story of the birth with them wrestling in the womb. Esau comes out and he's that red and hairy one. Jacob comes out grasping onto Esau's heel. And from the beginning, we have this story of sibling rivalry between the two. As that develops, It continues on, and we get to this famous scene of the birthright stew. And we have the birthright scene and the blessing scene. And today we're going to be looking at that birthright scene. Both have to do with food, but we're just going to be looking at that birthright stew scene today. So particularly focusing on Genesis 25, 29 through 34. So in this, I think the first question that I want to ask you, Cynthia, is in this scene, Jacob is cooking. Jacob's preparing this food. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished, Genesis 25:29 tells us. Is this a normal role for Jacob to be performing as the one cooking for himself or for the household? Or is there something that should be read into this scene with Jacob cooking and Esau coming home?
Yeah, and that's such a good question because I think there's more than one good answer. As biblical scholars do, we tend to think that, it could be this, it could be that. So I do think that typically the role of food preparation seems to have been under the purview and the control of the women of the household, in particular the matriarch of the household. And that is where a lot of, everyone in the household was constantly helping the household survive. Like there was, in one way, I think there's not much luxury of gender roles when you're just trying to survive.
Right.
But on the other hand, good arguments have been made that it does seem that women, in particular because of their reproductive roles, needed to be doing tasks closer to the dwelling. So for instance, if you're 8 months pregnant, you're not going to go plowing a field.
Hopefully
right?
not. Hopefully there's someone else.
Unless you have to, right?
Right.
So you do what you have to do. So I do think that everyone pretty much knew how to do everything.
Okay.
Right. It's all hands on deck, especially during like harvest and planting and certain times of year. Or if the men are called to war, the women and the children, have to step up and do more. Because, you think of it, you're living on a family farm, basically, and that farm doesn't take a vacation.
No, it doesn't take a vacation because you do.
Right. So everyone has to participate all the time. With that said, I do think that the women seem to oversee most of the food preparation, and that accorded them a lot more power and authority than we typically give them credit for. Now, I'm not saying this is an egalitarian society, not at all. Don't get me wrong. But I do think we tend to, look at this world in not a daily world as a survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, depending on the socioeconomic and geopolitical situations, there was probably a lot more of that than we tend to think. So I do think everybody knew how to do everything. So one reason why in the story, it doesn't quite surprise me that Jacob would know how to cook. But on the other hand, it does seem to have been the realm of the women.
Yeah.
And I think the text is trying to do that comparison between the two siblings. So here you have Esau as, his name even means red,
Yeah.
And same with his nickname, that we hardly ever get physical descriptions of people in narratives unless it has something to do with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime you see a physical description of somebody, you should pay attention.
Alarm bells should sound in our minds that something has changed here.
Right. And this is important to the story. So the fact that Esau is described as red and hairy, and that Jacob is described as, when they're born, as clutching Esau's heel, because that explains his name too, heel grabber, which in a smooth translation could mean trickster. So you should automatically know, then too, he's not to be trusted. Right. So he's not. But when you get to this scene where they're cooking, you have Esau coming in from the fields. He is the hunter.
Right.
And for someone to be a skillful hunter in a family is a big deal, because the eating of meat was not eaten as regularly as many of us eat today, it would have been, it's not that it never happened, but it would have been for special occasions, or if you needed to cull the herd, or if times were going well, then yeah, maybe you had some lamb chops or something. But most scholars, even those who are zoo archaeologists, would say that yes, they ate meat, but it wasn't anything like we think of today. But to have a skillful hunter in the family would have been a big deal, which is why he was their father, Isaac's favorite.
So,
and then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So should we then be reading is this a feminizing scene? Because I think a lot of times this gets portrayed as, okay, we have within these sons, we have that masculine, macho hunter Esau coming back, big, strong man, and we have feminine Jacob.
Yeah. Staying
at home. Is that a fair reading of this, or is that oversimplifying things?
Oh, I do. That's the reading I like to make with my students because it's fun. And I think it's a legitimate one. I mean, I don't think it's the only one, but I think it's a legitimate one that you have. I think what our biblical authors and redactors are doing here is having some fun with the symbol, like the comparison of sibling rivalry. Mm-hmm. That you have the comparison of the two siblings. You have the red, hairy, manly man in Esau, and then with Jacob being at home in the tents amongst the women, because that's typically considered women's space. He's the mama's boy.
Right.
And we do see that, a bit later on too.
So then as Esau returns, he comes home, we get, the part of the story that maybe we are most familiar with. Esau comes forward and he says, let me eat some of that red stuff. Now, depending on your translation, that may be a little bit different, but eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished. And so now we have our stew situation. Jacob is here cooking what, depending again on your translation, verse 34 describes as a lentil stew. But we have this exchange here where there's the trade that happens. In this scene, if Jacob is cooking, and cooking is normally, or maybe, I guess we should ask the question, is cooking an individual or a household task first, to then the second thing of, in this ask for the stew, is this a fair question of just like, hey, I'm coming home, you are cooking for everyone, give some of that? Or is this Jacob is cooking his lunch or dinner, and Esau is saying, you give me what's yours?
Yeah, my guess to that would be is that you don't just make an individual meal in this world.
Why wouldn't they make individual meals?
Yeah, because I mean, this is a. It's not that if there was some leftover bread that you didn't grab some bread or what have you, but when you're cooking a meal, from most of the studies I have done, it's a community household affair, and those resources, that food is precious. Mm-hmm. And it is usually the matriarch who oversees the food, who oversees what's stored, who is cooking, when they're, who gets how much and when. And so that's a lot of power and authority to determine who gets to eat.
Who gets to eat and not.
Yeah. And those food provisions are oftentimes very scarce. So to have someone just go in and make a meal for themselves, I don't see that happening.
Okay.
I think
so then you think he's cooking for the family?
That would be my guess, but they're nowhere it's not in the narrative. So we're making an educated guess.
Right. So if we're making the educated guess that he's cooking for everyone, and Esau comes back, would it be a normal thing? Because you're saying here that the matriarch's in charge of distributing this food. Is he stepping over a boundary and saying, give this to me, and that's what sets up the exchange? Or would it be expected as the skillful hunter, I go out and I do that, I come home, and what you do is this, so just give this to me?
Yeah, but he came home empty-handed.
He wasn't good today. He was a bad hunter on this occasion.
So he was unsuccessful in the hunt. And I mean, I'm not a hunter, but from the little bit I know, at least in the ancient world, it's It's not like hunting today where you might go out in the morning and go hunting and then come back. You go out until you're successful, but I mean, I could be wrong about in the ancient world until you come back, and I could be wrong about that. But he came. I don't doubt. If this was a real incident, you'll get emails about that, I'm sure. If we're taking it as just the narrative and that this has been crafted and told in a very good way,
right.
but if we were to think of the reality of the possible situation, if he came back empty-handed and he says he's famished, well, I don't doubt it. He probably hasn't. He's probably been gone a while, may not have had much to eat. So the fact that Jacob's cooking and that he's coming back, so it's showing them, being in their two realms and those realms in conflict.
And Esau says, like, I'm about to die when he comes back. Like, I'm so famished. What good is this to me? Which I does think lends itself, either he's very dramatic and he's making the most of the scene, or, he's been gone for a couple of days. He comes back and he's so hungry because, again, he wasn't very good on this day's hunt, or these days' hunts maybe, that he says, give me some of that. What good is this to me? And he makes this exchange of birthright for stew. But it also, I think it is interesting, as you mentioned before, we don't usually get descriptions of food. But here we do get that he gives him bread and lentil stew. And so this lentil stew that we have, do you see this as a special thing that's connected to something in this story? Or is this a glimpse at a very regular meal, a regular household meal for this world?
I think this would have been a regular meal. And typically, at least from my studies, typically the end of the day meal, when everyone's back from the fields and from all the tasks that they were doing, and something that, could have been, simmering for quite a while. So if I'm talking about like a potential reality of the story, this is a stew, a red lentil stew.
Mm-hmm. Red comes up again.
It comes up again, right? So I mean, the fact that it mentions the red part and Esau's red, I think they're deliberately playing on that.
Yeah.
And that, of course, bread is something would have had all the time. But if I'm thinking about potential reality, that stew would have been a daily fare.
So a daily that touches on some of the fun topical points too, with the red and this and that, but fits itself nicely into the setting that we have. But as you mentioned, that this is something that would be simmering all day in that world of survival. I think that is one of the details that we usually read over. I think because of our own eating habits, we come home and someone may have been cooking all day, or it may be I open up the cabinet or I open up the fridge for something to eat quite quickly. But for cooking a lentil stew, if you cook a lentil stew now, it takes time. If you're cooking a lentil stew then, it took time. That if you're in this survival mindset, the hours that have been dedicated to that food are very valuable, that there's time that's gone in here. And so it is this interesting dynamic between who has power and where. But the way that the food plays into the sibling rivalry, I think it is fun to talk about, because we normally just jump right over and he hunts, and he fails, and they do the trade, and look how silly he is, and let's move on to the next scene. But the insights that food pushes here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what's also interesting is that, Esau's the hunter, and that meat is special.
Yeah.
Right. It's not something that you eat all the time. It's not daily fare. Whereas what Jacob is cooking is daily fare, right? And so you get that dichotomy between about their two worlds as well. Yeah. And then also, lentils. I think I did a piece for Biblical Archaeology Review one time where I titled it "The Daily Stew." Give us, because everyone says the daily bread,
right?
But stews would have been, the main meal of the day. Lentils would have been a good source of protein. They would have been easy to grow. They would have helped their roots would help nourish the soil after, growing so much cereals within them. So a really important source of protein and nutrients and daily food. And, it's, you put it in some water and you put it on the stove in the oven or on the hearth, and, it kind of just simmers for a bit. And so you would go do other tasks, I'm sure. If I'm using my imagination, that's kind of the way I play it out.
But I think the fact that it's a regular thing makes the scene and the exchange here all the more heightened, maybe, because he's giving away such a big thing for not a special meal. It's not a feast. It's the everyday bowl of stew that you would presumably, maybe if he had some patience, he might have had access to already. But it's this rush and this power dynamic between the two of them, and what is the masculine in the story and the feminine in the story, or the roles of the brothers that we see being played out again here in the food relationship between these people, which is part of the surprise for me that more people haven't been talking about the role that food plays in these stories.
It's part of the family drama. I mean, how much of us have family dramas over Thanksgiving dinner?
Every big meal has to turn into a fight, right? It's nothing new. It's biblical. The fight at Thanksgiving is biblical.
Right.
So next time that blows up, just remember you're at a long tradition of fights over food and inheritance and birthrights and blessings. And I will have to come back for the second food story with Jacob and Esau at a future date. I want to save some of Jacob and Esau for later to look at another sibling story regarding food. And now this one is probably well known, but maybe not as well known, and not the same kind of fun story that maybe we associate with the Jacob and Esau story. And this is the story of Tamar and Amnon, and the description up front that this gets into questions of sexual violence and assault that happens in this narrative. And so in this story, we're in the Deuteronomistic history in that Davidic narrative, the succession narrative of King David. And Tamar and Amnon are our two big characters here. Tamar is a daughter of David, full sister of Absalom, a name you may be familiar with, but the half sister of Amnon, who is the oldest son of David. This story follows on the heels of the David and Bathsheba and Uriah sequence of events. And Amnon, we're told, falls in love with his sister Tamar. And Jonadab tells Amnon to pretend that he's sick, request Tamar come in and make him a meal, which Amnon does. Tamar makes him the meal. Amnon assaults her and then throws her out, which then leads later to part of the rebellion of Absalom, we're told in the text, as a reprisal here for the attack on his sister. But we're going to be focusing particularly on verses 5 through 10 in this, because there's a lot that happens if we're going to talk about David's household in this text that is normally kind of, the attention goes there and not towards the food part, but we're going to be looking at some of that food. And so as with Jacob and Esau, it's a story about appetites again that's coming through, both for food and then for, is it power, or is it birthrights, or is it relationships here? But I want to ask you first about the food that's prepared and kind of where it's prepared, because Amnon says to David, please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight so I may eat from her hand. And so she goes down, she took dough, she kneads it, and she makes cakes and baked the cakes. So the first question is this line of in my sight. What is this telling us about the situation? Is this just like he wants a power control if he wants to see her doing this? Or is this informing us like of the spatial categories of this text?
Yeah, I think it's probably a little of both. I think, from what the rest of the text says, it sounds like there's probably some sort of palace compound, and that Amnon, as the crown prince, has his own dwelling or part of, the compound or what have you. And that, when he's faking being ill,
right,
is when David is, of course, rightly concerned about him because he is the crown prince. And when he comes down to visit him and he says, you basically, what can I do for you? Of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but, and when Amnon says that that's what he wants, and David's like, oh, okay, sure. So it doesn't seem, at least, totally off hand because she is his sister. And although technically you wouldn't, be alone with a man that's not who's related to you or your husband in this world, it didn't seem off to David to be okay with that request. So he allows it. So when he wants to see her make it, I don't know if that means just come down to my house and make it, or does that mean like I just want to, watch her do this, which is just kind of creepy, but
yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and if you think about your typical Iron Age house, and it's hard to imagine if elite houses would have been exactly the same. But typically, you would be sleeping on the second floor of the house, and your oven and your food preparations would be on the bottom floor of the house. So it's a little difficult to say like what exactly that could have looked like, especially since archaeologically we don't know what the David's palace looked like. But I mean, he I guess he could have been, laying on the first floor watching her, or maybe his house was set up a little bit differently. It's kind of hard to say, but David didn't seem to think there was something wrong with that, which gives some people pause to possibly wonder, okay, did Tamar have a more of a role in the household and in the royal household than we typically think?
And I want to jump right on that question because it does feel like, on the one hand, that household role can maybe explain some of what, and if we know how this story ends. So when we're reading from the beginning, you see these things and you start to go, uh-oh. But if you put yourself in a situation where you don't know, understanding some of the household materials or the household layouts can maybe say, okay, I could see why David, why would you say yes? He's asking for his sister to come. And what's household and who does food? May be some apologetics for David, maybe for some people, of why this happens. But with the role that she has, is it just a sisterly role, or is there another role that she could be fulfilling when she comes down to make this food for him that's available to her?
Yeah, so it's been argued that it talks about like what she's wearing, which also you normally don't get that either. So it says and the way it's often translated is a tunic with long sleeves. Yeah. And the only other time that word is used is when it's referring to Joseph's coat, right? Which is typically translated as a coat of many colors. And here it's translated as a tunic with long sleeves. So it's a bit of how should we translate both of these? And so some people have argued that the tunic with long sleeves indicates some sort of, royal status, which then would, be symbolic of Joseph's future kind of status. But it's also been argued that maybe as, the virginal daughter of the king, that, she had some sort of like household kind of religious role. I mean, not like an official priest or anything, but that maybe, within the household and religious and healing, and women were typically related with, midwifery and healing and medicinal stuff, actions. So it's not entirely unheard of that was maybe possibly her role. Or, also there's the thing about, women overseeing the food. So it's like, oh, okay, well, let's get one of the women. Oh, he's asking for a specific woman. Okay, let's, get her down here. So, and we don't get any indication of what Tamar is thinking. I mean, she goes down there and she doesn't, but we don't hear, she doesn't have a voice until he assaults her.
We don't get her inner monologue leading down into this scene.
Right.
But it is, again, as with the story of the Jacob and Esau situation, a complicated food story that the more you unwrap some of these layers of the household dynamics and who does what, seemingly makes this plan between the two of them all the more, unfortunately, plausible. That you're asking for a sister and you're asking for maybe somebody who has this kind of cultic role in the household already, and in that it just sets the trap layer upon layer so that it's all the more likely that she will come into essentially the layer here to be assaulted, which makes the story so much, I don't know, more, it's so much sadder the more you look into of the ways that the end result, as it is heartbreaking already. But the more we understand about the ancient world and how they may be playing on her role or manipulating her through the things that she's supposed to do, just informs more of the perspective in this and why the reaction to this story is what it is, because it stacks layer upon layer of the assault that has happened. It is against her, and it is against the household, and against a sibling, and against potentially someone who oversees ritual in the household, that this thing continues to grow, and the spiral of David's household just gets out of control.
Right. Yeah. Wow. You said that very well.
Well, I was trained by you, so I'm very happy to. But I do, on the note of her coat and her robes here, with the cake that she makes, because normally it's just translated as cakes. But the word that gets used here is a unique word, right?
Oat, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it can be, it's oftentimes translated as cakes, but it really just says, made this particular dish, right? And it really has its root in the Hebrew word for heart. Mm-hmm. And so some people think, they're cakes that are maybe heart-shaped. And, I think about that and I think, well, there are other indicators in the text that, make it sound like, well, maybe it's more of like a hearty, where it gets the word heart, but hearty, kind of like a hearty dish. Like the way I think of it is, when we get sick, a lot of people want chicken soup.
Right.
So maybe this is a particular meal that is made when somebody is feeling poorly. And again, remember, in this world, you get sick, the chance of it just being something minor is nothing like today. So you can understand David's concern. And so if David is concerned and Amnon wants the woman of the household who is in charge of healing, who is does healing stuff, and could make a meal that would help with the healing, then you can understand why they would be like, oh yeah, okay, let's get this. We don't want the crown prince to die.
Right. The line is in danger here. The household ritual side of it, though, I think does open up this other lane of understanding how we should be reading this text, because the Bible describes maybe one set of practices that should be followed, but there's always the question of, is this really what's happening? And this household religious cult that she may be participating in can feed into the understanding of why ask for this meal, why ask for the hearty dumplings that may be that special thing ritually that can help bring him back. Because if he dies, the prince dies, what happens to the household?
But there's no temple yet either.
Right.
So we always have to make that distinction between, official sanctioned religious practices and the unofficial kind of household, everyday people, religious activities. And again, this is, early on in Israel's monarchy, temple's not built yet. And even when the temple is built, it does seem like from other archaeological studies and other textual studies from, that women did play a role in household religious practices. And so the fact that she is possibly one of these in the royal household, it's not terribly surprising, at least to me.
And I want to ask a follow-up question on the heart or hearty cakes question, because I have seen it described before as, right, she makes heart cakes. This, whether they're it feels like it kind of goes down that Valentine's Day tradition of like, oh, it's a nice heart-shaped thing and it's this love story. But it seems like that can easily start to lean towards, because we don't get any backstory from her perspective, we don't see her insight. It feels very close to being tipped over into, well, look at what he asked her to make this. She comes and she does. So is she a willing participant, or is she complicit? Because look, she's made these heart cakes for him. What would you say to people that have heard that explanation before? Is that something that they should have an answer for, or how can they respond to that?
That because they interpret it as heart-shaped cakes that she was asking for it?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say a strong word here, but I don't think that we want to keep this family friendly. No, absolutely not. You cannot ever blame the victim, even in an ancient text.
I wanted to present it because, if you, unfortunately, in looking around at this story, this is an interpretation that you see sometimes, or you see being brought forward in this. How are we trying to understand the dynamic and downplaying what he's doing and making some apologetics on one side or another that unfortunately is still common?
Well, and that's when feminist criticism is really helpful, because, when people say, well, the right interpretation, it's like, well, what's the right interpretation? And normally people are thinking of the traditional interpretation, which has historically been done by, men from certain socioeconomic backgrounds from, Europe and North America. So when we get into these other types of interpretation, especially things like feminist criticism and womanist criticism, ideological criticism, post-colonial, all these other criticisms that allow us to look at the text through a different set of lenses, as opposed to just the so-called, traditional Orthodox interpretation of these texts. Because, women are going to see something a little bit differently in these texts than a lot of men, say maybe from the 1800s would. Yes. So I would say that even if she did make heart-shaped cakes, that is not a sign that's not a signal to anybody to do anything. I mean, he was already planning it.
Right.
He already had a plan in place, regardless of, what she made, that he knew what he was going to do, and he had a plan. And nothing she made would have stopped that.
Cynthia, thank you for walking us through the food in these scenes today. Complicated stories and sometimes difficult and uncomfortable stories, but I do think it's important to look at some of these finer aspects to see how this can continue to shed light and maybe get us to ask more questions about this. If you're listening along today and we didn't cover something that you'd be interested in hearing more about in the future, or a follow-up question, as always, you can leave it in the comments, and we may be able to get Cynthia to come back and answer that question for you in the future, or we can respond to that for you. But Cynthia, thank you for joining us today for this conversation about food in the ancient world. I really appreciate it. I'm always so happy to get to talk to you. And I know everyone, I expect some good reviews. Yeah, maybe some questions, some pushback naturally, but I think people will really enjoy this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, for everyone here at Bible and Archaeology, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you next week.